Okay, now, okay, well, we're ready when you are.
Okay, thanks, Anne.
Okay.
Okay, well, welcome to the ETA lecture on Module B, Critical Study of Literature, Poetry, T.S. Eliot. My name's Karen McEwen. Now, before we start, I'll just do the acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Before we delve into Eliot, we're going to do a couple of things. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to look a little bit again at the rubric, which I'm sure you've sort of pored over in class. But it's important to remember that the rubric is what NESA uses as the guide to both the teaching and learning that's involved in Module B. And this is where questions can come from. Particular terminology in the rubric needs to be sort of clear in your head because it could be picked up in the exam. So when we're talking about Module B, we're talking about detailed analytical and critical knowledge and understanding and appreciation of the text. And at this point, I might remind you that your text is in fact the entire suite of poems. And NESA assumes that you know that to the extent that you could in fact have a poem specified. And you really do not want to have a situation in either your trial HSC or HSC where you're looking at the question and it's asking you to write a response on Prufrock, for example, and you say to yourself, well, I kind of remember doing that in class, but I haven't looked at that for 6 months. So I always say, have your favourites, have your poems you'd like to talk about, like to write about, but also don't neglect any of them. So the key word here that I've highlighted is informed. Okay, informed and personal response to the entirety of the text. So this means that there is an expectation that you've read beyond the poetry, that you've actually looked at some critical material, that you've reflected on different ways of interpreting poetry. So today I'll be giving you my readings, my interpretation, but it's also wise to go into that realm of looking at critical discourse. What have academics said about Eliot's poetry over the years, and to what extent do you agree with those? To what extent have they sort of informed or made you reflect on your view? We're thinking of the distinctive qualities of the text, so this is talking about obviously poetic techniques, particular ideas that permeate Eliot's poetry, particular ways the poems are structured. We'll be talking about that. Notions of textual integrity and significance. This whole idea of textual integrity refers to the unity of the text, the ways in which all elements of the text work holistically towards the achievement of the text. It's a little bit like looking at a masterpiece, the Mona Lisa, and how all elements of the ways in which Leonardo da Vinci painted the Mona Lisa all work cohesively to kind of make it the magnificent painting that it is. Okay, now we're looking at the close analysis of construction, content and language. So this is the ways in which the poetry is constructed, the particular forms, what they're about and the language in it, and how you have a rich, detailed, complex understanding of it. That these judgments that you do make are based on detailed evidence from your research and reading beyond the text. That you do think about notions of context, you know, when Eliot wrote his poetry, how was it received then? How is it received today in our postmodern world? And then you'll think about, obviously, the perspectives of others, and you may in fact include reference to those perspectives in your response, your written response to the poetry, as a way of arguing, proposing a way of seeing the poem or poems. And you'll sort of use all of these ideas that you'll explore to strengthen your informed personal perspective. So what we're going to start with is a consideration of modernism. Now, modernism is where the literary movement, if you will, in which Eliot was composing his poetry. And it's really important that you have a very sound and considered understanding of modernism. So the values of modernism. Modernism, this is in our sort of first half of the 20th century, loosely speaking, the first 50 years. We're talking about notions of chaos, meaninglessness, pessimism, this idea of fluctuating meaning, fluctuating values, changing values. We're talking about loss of faith in what is essentially godless world. Think about the impact, for example, of that grand narrative of World War I, the war to end all wars. Idea of collapse of morality, values, a world where people have become cynical about sort of religion and the values of religion, where secularism has sort of been embraced by particularly some of the intellectuals of this period. A confused sense of identity, and this sort of pervasive angst, despairing sort of quality. So we're looking at the characteristics of modernism in literature. We've got literature which exhibits what we call perspectivism, which means the meaning comes from the individual's perspective and is thus personalised. In fact, this idea that meaning can only come from the individual. A single story might be told from the perspective of several different people with the assumption that the truth is somewhere in the middle. This lack of certainty, lack of clarity, which of course creates this sense of angst. We're also looking at the perception of language changes, and certainly Eliot was very aware of this. It's no longer seen as transparent or clear, allowing us to see through to reality. It's now the way the individual constructs this reality. And so this is quite an important point. Language is thick with multiple meanings and varied connotative forces. In other words, there is this complexity of meaning within the way in which language is used, and the role of the reader or responder is to navigate that and come up with some sort of sense of meaning that resonates with that individual. Certainly, modernists were interested in the experimental. Art is artifact rather than reality. We were certainly, talking about that idea of movement away from reality. Certainly organised non-sequentially. So you've got experiences portrayed as layered, elusive, sort of connected to various ideas, discontinuous, using fragmentation and juxtaposition. So we're not looking at lineal sort of texts, chronological texts necessarily, and obviously we'll see this in the poetry. Ambiguous endings, open endings, which are seen as more representative reality, where there is no clarity, there is no certainty. And if we look at art as a way of kind of exploring, this has been much clearer for students who do study visual arts, but for all students, this idea of looking at art as a way of understanding this way of thinking. So we've got the events that took place during these tumultuous times had a deep and wide-ranging impact on the aesthetic sensibility. So artists felt that traditional art forms could no longer express this modern psychological state of dislocation, alienation and anxiety. You can see here with some sort of cubism, futurism, Gauguin, Picasso, etc. Some of the people who are looking at these ideas in the context of visual arts. So experimentation, this was certainly a hallmark of what was happening with Eliot's poetry in terms of both style and subject matter. And this phrase, which was attributed to Ezra Pound, another writer from the period, make it new. So this idea of challenging what art looks like, and in this instance, what poetry looks like. So primitivism, that's probably not a very clear heading there. Modernists were inspired by Native American and African American art, very obsessed with primitive material and attitudes, and this led into Freudian and Jungian psychology. Jung was a post Freudian psychologist, and they were both looking at hidden subconscious motives, and the primitive appeared to offer a setting to explore their theories of psychology and sexuality. So this was a world that was seen to represent a world unaffected by the constraints of modernity. Now, you might think, where are we going with all of this? All of these ideas kind of inform the way, excuse me, the ways of thinking we need to come to with Eliot's poetry. So coming to the spirit of modernist literature, we've got a strong and conscious break with tradition, rejecting traditional values and assumptions. Modern was seen as being historical discontinuity, sense of alienation, loss and despair. A rejection not only of history, but also the society of whose fabrication history is a record. So history is seen as a construct, as something which is coming from a particular perspective, not necessarily representative of reality. This is an interesting point. Poetry was seen by the modernists as a meaningful activity where the search for meaning is carried out. And I think that's what we see pervading Eliot's poetry, is this sense of a search for meaning, trying to find meaning in these sort of urban settings. So looking again at techniques, again, this idea of making it new, this radical use of a kind of formlessness. We've got collapse plots. We've got fragmentary techniques, and that kind of is something you really want to think about in terms of Eliot's poetry. Shifts in perspective, voice and tone. Stream of consciousness point of view, associative techniques. So modernist literature is notable for what it omits: the explanations, interpretations, connections, summaries, and distancing that provide continuity, perspective, and security in traditional literature. So there's lots of questions that are raised in modernist literature, indeed modernist poetry. So you've got this fragmentation, and this fragmentation reflects the reality of the flux and fragmentation of one's life. There isn't a coherence. There is that lack of order and sequence and unity. And so what you see is a work becomes an assemblage of fragments. And you might, for example, think about Preludes there, in the way you have a series of vignettes, a series of openings, which are sort of fragments, disconnected in many respects, but obviously there are some ideas or emotions or tones that kind of connect those various vignettes in that poem, for example. So these fragments might be drawn from diverse areas of experience. They could be vignettes, little sort of stories, bits of stories of contemporary life, chunks of popular culture, dream imagery, this idea of dream imagery coming from the impact of psychology and psychoanalysis, and symbolism, which might be drawn from the composer's private repertory of life experiences. They could move across time and space, shifting from the public to the personal. So the shifts in perspective, voice and tone. So inclusion of all sorts of material which might be considered unliterary previously, including representations of speech of the uneducated, the inarticulate, more colloquial, slangy, popular. Because there is this challenging of the educated literary voice as some means of conveying truth or culture, having lost that sense of authority, that sense of truth. So there's this aim for directness, compression, and vividness. Again, three key words here. Sparing of words, very, very judicious in their use of words as a way of kind of really trying to navigate this realm of meaninglessness in some sort of ironically coherent way. Again, often written in the first person. In fact, what Eliot does at times is also uses the second person, or to limit the reader to one character's point of view on the action, which we might see in Prufrock, for example. Truth does not exist objectively, but is the product of a personal interaction with reality. So the selected point of view, again, this idea of marginalising the academic or the more what might be perceived traditionally as a more authoritative voice, with a naive or marginal person, the person who is the child or the outsider, who may be less constrained by what are the expectations or assumptions that are made by some sort of more public discourse. Now, Another key influence on Eliot was the symbolist poets. These were a group of French poets who were active in the last 30 years of the 19th century, such as Baudelaire. These were rebel poets. They were challenging what poetry should look like. They were looking inward, exploring the shifting and subtle states of the human psyche. And they thought poetry should evoke and suggest using poetic techniques to recreate a sense of human consciousness. So this idea of trying to navigate this very kind of surreal world of the unconscious self. Now, looking across Eliot's poetry, remember we're talking about the suite of poems. We're not just talking about individual poems. What are some of the images that kind of are dealt with across the poetry? We have flowers, both real and artificial, and I think it's very well worthwhile, if you're not sure of what the flowers that are specified in the poems look like, that you actually do look at them, look at images of them, so you have a greater sense of what Eliot might be doing here. You have smoke and fog. You have various parts of the human body, which of course leads to techniques such as synecdoche. More about that later. Lots of sea and sea life and underwater images, city streets, light, stairs, music, smell, clothing, hair, eating, and the colour yellow. And yellow, as it's associated with, I think, a dirtiness, a sense of squalor, a sense of disease. You have sound. Eliot loves playing with sound in his poetry. So you have alliteration, onomatopoeia, assonance, sibilance, rhyme, rhythm, caesura, and enjambment. Again, if you're not sure about any of these, check them out and reflect on the ways in which they're used in the poetry. There's a musicality to Eliot's poetry, which we need to think about. Eliot perceived himself as an intellectual. He was an intellectual, and his poetry makes various allusions. Some of these are classical allusions to mythology, for example. Some of them are literary. You know, the one obvious one is to Hamlet in Prufrock, and biblical, as we'll see, for example, again in Prufrock. We see it in Journey of the Magi, and so on. He also uses rhetorical techniques, particularly rhetorical questions and repetition in his poetry. And there are other rhetorical techniques, more sort of obscure ones you could consider as well, but they're the two key that he uses. He uses contrast, tone, pun, playing on words, paradox, allegory, stories that represent ideas, emotive language. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go through the individual poems. We're going to talk about ideas, and we're going to talk about examples. And I think it's really important in your preparation to be making connections across poems. We don't have time to do that at great length today, but that should be something you should be doing in your preparation for responding to the poetry. You know, how are ideas, how are techniques dealt with across the poems, not just simply remaining within each poem as a discrete entity. So Journey of the Magi, you know, we've got the grand narrative of the three wise men, the three kings who visited Christ when he was born in Bethlehem. So this kind of narrative becomes an opportunity for Eliot to allegorically, you know, use this grand narrative to look at this sort of human sort of search for meaning, search for spiritual meaning, alienation, that sense of disconnection, despair, sense of estrangement, that lack of certainty and control, and of course our desire to try and obtain that, albeit often in a futile way. The experience of suffering, suffering sort of not necessarily physically, but psychologically, spiritually. Obviously spirituality in a general sense, and of course this idea of our confrontation with our mortality. This poem, in terms of construction form, is a dramatic monologue. and we have the voice of the Magus speaking directly to us. And we have a very arresting style because it's quite conversational. You've got this informal syntax with this, rearrangement of words. Weather sharp, a hard time we had of it. This is the Magus kind of in an informal way recounting his experience and the journey. It doesn't tell us much about what he found there. It's more about the journey before and after arriving in Bethlehem. We've got the sibilance of the summer palaces on slopes, the terraces and the silken girls bringing sherbet, which sort of highlights the sort of the rather lovely, luxurious, pleasurable aspects of the journey. And then you've got the present participle of the cursing and grumbling and running away and wanting their liquor and women, giving us a sense of the ongoing problem that the Magi had with their camel handlers as they were actually on their journey. The poem makes use of biblical allusions, 3 trees, an old white horse. Now, again, probably worthwhile, we haven't talked about it at length, but worthwhile doing a bit of research on Eliot's own spiritual journey, his own conversion, how that has informed his poetry, what he's kind of thinking about as he's composing his poems. So we've got the 3 trees, the old white horse, the dicing for pieces of silver, all kind of allusions to aspects of the Christian narrative. The tone in it was, as you may say, satisfactory. So there's this amazing understatement about what the 3 Magi found and what they might have, how their reaction might have been. That sense of, well, yeah, it was okay, but that sense of frustration, it didn't really answer all the questions that they were hoping they would have answered. The rhetorical questions, were we led this way for birth or death? The repetition of birth and death, that whole kind of grappling with ideas of one's mortality. And of course, the sense at the end of the poem of the word choice of alien and clutching, the sense of estrangement and disconnection from his own people when he goes back hoping to have resolved some of these challenging issues, but feeling no sense of certainty at all. So again, this will be fairly short and sharp what I'm doing with each of these poems, but and obviously there's far more you could say about each of these poems, but this is just some ideas to give you some food for thought. Now, Preludes is interesting. Preludes, of course, is a reference to a short musical form. It's a preface standing on its own or introducing another piece. We need to remember, it's not on the slide, but we need to remember that this particular poem, like Rhapsody, has a flaneur, F-L-A-N-E-U-R. If you're not familiar with flaneur, it's a reference to an objective, detached, it's a French term, objective, detached streetwalker. So this is the persona that Eliot has created in these poems, somebody who's literally walking around these sort of fairly decrepit urban streets and making observations, and that objective voice creates a disturbing tone as well. So we have an alienating and isolating nature of existence, particularly in the context of an empty, dilapidated, modern urban world. Now, we do know that Eliot was basing it in part on Paris, but in part on other urban centres in his native United States. We have a series of vignettes, possible scenarios, and of course, they're quite fragmented. We're waiting for something to happen. There's either an absence of humanity or very few people, and there's a sense that we've just got sort of grabbed a snatch of something. It's been described as a video postcard of a moment, and we are left as readers to reflect on what might have happened yet after that. You know, that we've given something, but what's happening beyond that? So the ideas in Preludes, again, it's this idea of alienation, and this time it's this alienating experience of life in a modern urban setting, where ironically, despite being surrounded by a lot of people, there's a sense of being alone, being disconnected to others. The feelings of despair, the depression, oppression associated with poverty. The poems are largely inhabited by not a great deal people, but the people we see are people who have experienced hardship, whose lives are sort of quite grueling in terms of their downtrodden penury. We have flawed relationships with those, communication difficulties, a sense of lack of meaning and purpose, a sense of life being tedious, routine, repetitive. We're looking at survival in a godless world, a secularized world, and of course suffering associated with that. Some quotations and techniques. We've got the alliteration of smell of steaks in passageway to 6 o'clock. Now remarkably, I learned only last year that apparently steaks were common food at the turn of the century for poorer people, which is interesting compared to today. But this is a very olfactory way of creating the world of the poem. The metaphor, the burnt out ends of smoky days, a very powerful way of likening the bleakness of life here to the residual remains of a cigarette. The synecdoche of the grimy scraps of withered leaves about your feet, all its muddy feet that press to early coffee stands or trampled by insistent feet. One thinks of all the hands and short square fingers stuffing pipes. Now, synecdoche is a great technique. It's a type of metaphor. And by actually isolating it onto an aspect of the human body, you are creating this sense of a disembodied person. You are, in a way, dehumanizing the individuals in this poem, and hence the reason for Eliot's extensive use of synecdoche. We have the connotations of words like stale, trampled, muddy, dingy. This is a dirty environment. We feel almost as if we need to wash our hands after delving in poems such as Preludes. The personification of the morning comes to consciousness, a sense of waking up. The morning, ironically, is personified, whereas there is a lack of humanity in existence here. A sense of consciousness is a drugged. The use of second person. Eliot takes us into the poem. We become characters in the poem. We're in it. We are there with him, observing these people, observing this setting. And then that very striking biblical allusion, his soul stretched tight across the skies, a sense of existential despair, a sense of spiritual sort of suffering. And then the difficulty trying to grapple with what are we really talking about here in this poem. So we've got this repetition of infinite, of the adverb infinitely gentle, infinitely suffering thing. Not infinite, adjective, not adverb. And of course the repetition of you. We also have some quite enigmatic or mysterious portraits of the inhabitants of this world, including the woman who watched the night revealing the thousand sordid images of which your soul constituted. You curled the papers from your hair or clasped the yellow soles of feet in the palms of both soiled hands. So many commentators speculate that these could be prostitutes, perhaps. But certainly these are people whose lives are characterised by poverty and a fairly desperate sort of focus on survival. I think we could certainly say that. Moving on to Prufrock. Now, Prufrock is characterised by ideas such as alienation, estrangement, indecision, despair, again, flawed relationships, communication difficulties, lack of meaning and purpose, suffering, disillusionment. Prufrock has been described as the quintessential modernist man with his neurotic, anxious, and self-absorbed perspective. And he is a created persona, so this particular poem is in fact a dramatic monologue. The opening is an allusion to Dante's Inferno, so obviously that sort of gives us a sense that Eliot's suggesting that we are as per Dante's Inferno, embarked on some sort of descent into hell, into a kind of hell that Prufrock has created for himself perhaps, but indeed connotations of hell. Now, one of the things that's interesting about Eliot's language is that he likes to use allusions which come from his extensive knowledge about the zeitgeist, what's happening in his world. And he starts this poem with a very arresting image of when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table. So he's comparing the evening as it's gradually sort of coming to some sort of, oppressive sort of state, as like a patient that's been anesthetized. Now, ether, of course, is a very early form of anesthetic, which would have been, very new and cutting edge at the time that this poem was written. So again, this complexity dealing with the conscious and the unconscious self. We then have the repetition of let us go, and again, as we saw in Preludes, the invitation to us. We are invited into the poem. Eliot wants us in the poem, so Prufrock invites us. We've got, again, reference to questions and rhetorical questions, overwhelming question, do I dare disturb the universe? How should I presume? Lift and drop a question. Now, of course, there's a great deal of ambiguity about what these questions are, and are these questions about banal ones, about Prufrock's sense of self, or are they more profound or meaningful ones about the meaning of life, where it's never made clear? And so again, I think Eliot, through Prufrock, is leaving us to ponder what they may be. We have the repetition and the allusion to the Renaissance painter Michelangelo in the room. The women come and go talking of Michelangelo. I think this is a really quite a sarcastic comment about the women. Prufrock feels somewhat unable to communicate with them, somewhat alienated, and he kind of is mocking their pseudo intellectualism with the reference to Michelangelo. They feel they're talking about things in a fairly educated, informed way, but in fact they're not. You have the repetition of the word yellow. Again, you are to make of it what you will. What are we talking about here? Is it a dirtiness, a grubbiness, a sense of disease? What does he mean? The metaphor of fog. I measured out my life with coffee spoons, a lovely banal metaphor. You sometimes see it ironically in coffee shops and on tea towels. But what's it a reference to? This idea of the meaninglessness of life. Is our life just simply measured by the endless cups of coffee that we take? And again, that lift and drop a question on your plate. To spit out all the butt ends of my days and ways. Again, there's use of cigarette imagery to kind of capture that sense of the detritus of what's left of life. So you've got the juxtaposition here between the banal details versus more esoteric or philosophical reflections in our complex Prufrock's character. You've got in enjambment, so dropping of lines, so you get this sort of fragmented, dislocated sense of these questions being asked. Do I dare? New line, disturb the universe, that sense of hesitancy. The synecdoche of faces and eyes, again, disembodied parts of the human body. A pair of ragged claws scuttling across the floors of silent seas. Again, it's a very, very powerful image. If you think about it, if we're talking about a crustacean here, is it a lobster, is it a crab? The claws are what it fights with. It sometimes, they sometimes lose a claw because of the fighting. A sense of kind of survival in an aggressive world. If you think about scuttling, we're talking about sideways movements. We're talking about a creature that's not really progressing, but kind of surviving in what is an aggressive world that's attacking the individual. Again, arms, the women are described in terms of their arms, which are braceleted, that kind of probably erotic sense of sensuality associated with bare arms. And again, showing off his knowledge of science, of what was happening intellectually in his time period. I've already mentioned the first example of personification and simile at the beginning of the poem, referring to the evening like a patient etherized upon a table. But we then have when I am formulated sprawling on a pin, when I'm pinned and wriggling on the wall. So like an insect that has been like a scientific specimen being sort of imprisoned in a framed display case, this sort of sense of being observed, being examined, but in a way that is painful and certainly one feels terribly exposed and vulnerable. And then this last reference, but as if a magic lantern through the nerves and patterns on a screen, is a reference to early X-ray, which is a very powerful way of saying that sense of an X-ray being compared to, can you actually see inside me and understand me, the real me? We also have the allusions, particularly to Hamlet. And I think, interestingly, here, when he's talking about Hamlet, he is talking about, I am not Hamlet. And of course, Hamlet was the individual who, you know, in Shakespeare's play, deliberated, a control freak, if you will, who procrastinated in terms of his directive to seek revenge. And the attendant lord, who could that be? I often think it could be a reference to Hamlet's friend from university, Horatio, his loyal friend, not the disloyal Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, but Horatio, the lord who offers at the end of the play to commit suicide, saying he feels more like the antique Roman than the Dane. So the offer, like as Hamlet's dying, I will die with you, my lord. And of course, Hamlet directs him, no, you must live and tell the story. So it's interesting. On one hand, Prufrock is saying he has no delusions of grandeur. He's not a prince, but then on the other hand, he is sort of heroic in some ways. We have imagery associated with time for you and time for me and time yet for 100 indecisions. In a minute there is time for decisions and revisions. Again, this lovely playfulness with rhyme, which a minute will reverse, and indeed there'll be time, evenings, mornings and afternoons. And again, there was a French philosopher, Henry Bergson, you should again look him up, who kind of speculated about the way we construct a concept of time. And this is certainly something, again, that Eliot would have explored, would have read about, and is alluding to in his poetry as he explores this concept of time. So just again, that's Henry, Henri Bergson, who Bergson, who is exploring this concept of time. Again, we use biblical allusion tapping into those grand narratives that people understand, and using that to kind of convey ideas relating to suffering and despair. Lazarus, the man who was brought back to life, Christ's period of suffering, wept and fasted, wept and prayed. Again, you know, delusions of grandeur. Prufrock's kind of likening himself to Christ in some ways. The rhetorical question, do I dare to eat a peach? A peach, again, a very sort of seductive fruit that kind of has connotations of sexuality, sensuality. And finally, imagery associated with mermaids that lingered in the chambers of the sea, by seagulls wreathed with seaweed, red and brown, to human voices wake us and we drown. You know, look, I think we could say Prufrock struggles with his relationships with women, seeing women as sexual sirens, as people who are provocative, seductive, yet cruel. It's up to you to decide how you perceive him, but certainly this is an individual struggling with his sense of self, sense of identity. Okay, Rhapsody on a Windy Night is another one of Eliot's poem, which sits very nicely with Preludes because it's also a poem with a flaneur, F-L-A-N-E-U-R. So again, with that detached, objective, streetwalker who is the observer of what he is seeing. So again, like Preludes, it also uses this musical term. Rhapsody in music is a piece of irregular form that often allows for improvisation, and I think that's really key to think about in terms of the structure of this poem. It is quite fragmented. There is a sense of an almost dream-like stream of consciousness in Rhapsody. And so, as I've said here, it's dream-like fragmented. And the use of disparate symbols to try and grapple with this idea of meaning. But, ironically, it is loosely shaped around the chronological clock, which we have informed by our street lamps. So some of the ideas here, we have this, again, like Preludes, the alienating experience of urban life, the irony of living with lots of people yet being still so alone, alienation, isolation, estrangement, desperation, despair. This is a place where people are poor, struggling to survive, struggling to eke out an existence. Looking at this idea of memory and its impact, and of course, related to this, the conscious versus the unconscious self, and the way that it sort of impacts on the individual's thinking and the way they're operating in the world. So we have the personification of the street lamp, the lamplight, I should say. The street lamp sputtered, the street lamp muttered, the street lamp said. It's the one structuring device which is clear in the poem. The simile of every street lamp that I pass beats like a fatalistic drum, that sense of, you know, going towards some sort of future which is unknown. Again, we've got women and a woman in this poem. The door opens like a grin and you see the corner of her eye twists like a crooked pin. So a disturbing simile that kind of suggests possibly both violence, possibly existential pain, psychological pain. Is she a prostitute? Perhaps. Doesn't matter. She's certainly somebody who is poor and struggling to eke out an existence. Again, the references to cats, we go back to Prufrock for cats as well. And if you think about it, cats are solitary creatures and very much survivors. And you've got this very disturbing image of the cat devouring, which is sort of eating greedily, a morsel of rancid butter, you know, that adjective rancid, capturing how revolting and off this butter would be, yet the desperation of this animal. Imagery associated with the moon, and remember the moon is not constant, it does move. Remember, the moon is associated with lunacy, madness, so held in a lunar synthesis, whispering lunar incantation. The moon is personified. The moon is personified into some sort of damaged woman that's lost her memory. Again, is this a prostitute? Perhaps. Certainly somebody who is damaged, lost her memory with the old nocturnal smells. You know, smell, that olfactory sense really does permeate the poetry. That cross across her brain. A washed out smallpox cracks her face, so there's damage from previous disease, you know, evidence of previous disease. Her hand twists a paper rose, not a real rose, but a paper rose. So something decorative, but certainly ephemeral. It smells of dust and old cologne. She's alone with all the old nocturnal smells. So we have again that cross across her brain. So very disturbing images of smell that really give us a sense of repugnance about what this world is like. Again, we've got crab imagery as we had in Prufrock. You've got the crab one afternoon in a pool, an old crab with barnacles on his back, gripped the end of a stick which I held him. So this sort of notion of desperation and aggression. The olfactory imagery again, the personification and simile of midnight shakes the memory as a madman shakes a geranium. Now, this is the influence of Baudelaire and the symbolist poets, these sort of obscure, complex images. What do they mean? Again, a bit of some dead geranium here on the slide. Geraniums have lots and lots of petals. They're very commonplace, particularly in flower boxes in Europe. So this is a flower Eliot knows. That sense of lots and lots of memories, just as there are lots and lots of petals on a geranium, and they're just being shaken and randomly spread everywhere. And the very disturbing, visceral metaphor of the last twist of the knife. Now, the Hollow Men is a challenging poem. Again, it's a dronic monologue appearing to be spoken by either one or more than one of the Hollow Men. It starts with the epigraph "A penny for the old guy," so it's sort of the whole allusion to Guy Fawkes, the individual that tried to blow up Parliament 400 years ago or so. And this particular poem is again looking at hopelessness and the meaninglessness of life in a decaying world, loss, mortality and death. So you can see, if you look at these ideas across the suite of poems, there are lots of connections you can make in terms of ideas across poems. Again, that intellectualism in terms of the structure and style of this poem. You've got the literary allusions to Conrad's Heart of Darkness. This was a modernist novella written by Joseph Conrad, published at sort of the turn of the 20th century, which sort of set in Africa and is exploring that sort of the darkness at the heart of humanity. Very much a concern that kind of pervades Eliot's poetry. Again, Dante's Divine Comedy, sense of hell. Julius Caesar, Shakespeare, the assassination of Caesar, and the ways in which that sort of explores aspects of the political nature of human beings, the ways in which we attack each other, hurt each other. And of course, the whole allusion to Guy Fawkes as a historical reference. There's lots of, this is sort of always, it has elements of being like mantra-like at times, this poem, with the repetition of "We are the hollow men." The analogy of "as wind in dry grass or rats feed over broken glass," again, that tactile sense of pain and damage and squalor. Again, synecdoche, eyes and voices, this sort of disembodied part of the whole. Repetition and personification of death's other kingdom, and death's dream kingdom, of death's twilight kingdom. A sort of pseudo reference to Christianity's reference to kingdom. And then we do have a direct allusion to the Lord's Prayer. So we're looking at individuals struggling to find meaning in what is perceived to be a world, struggling with spirituality, struggling with what mainstream religion would be offering. And then abutting that, you have the satirical allusion to the doggerel verse of nursery rhymes, which are then played with. So instead of "here we go around the mulberry bush," which of course is a reference to contracting disease, allegedly, scarlet fever, to "prickly pear." And again, sense of that that sort of tactile, I should say, tactile meaning touch, sense of being hurt, a series of whole lot of hurts, which we see in this poem. Again, the voice using enjambment, using dropped lines, that sense of fragmentation, that sense of giving us a disrupted voice. There's not this sort of clarity and cohesion and clear and sort of clear voice that we see in this poem. The paradox of shape without form, shape without colour, paralysed force, gesture without motion. So trying to kind of get to the heart of what's the hollow man / men, what are they trying to talk about? And then the ultimate nihilistic comment that we end with: this is the way the world ends, this is the way the world ends, it's the way the world ends, not with a bang but a whimper. So a sense of nihilism. Don't forget that we are looking at a time when Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism, that sort of search for meaning, and sort of seeing that search for meaning residing with a search in our humanity, was certainly something that was happening at this time as well. So now we're going to look at some HSC questions in our last few minutes. Now, we know that we could be asked a very broad question for all of Module B, Critical Study of Literature, or we could be asked for a question simply on poetry, and you would then, not specifically on Eliot's poetry, but on poetry generally, and you would then come into this with your discussion of Eliot. We're going to look at a few questions here to give you some ideas, and the key thing would be to practice these. Now, practice writing a response in a very kind of considered way with all your notes and materials, really spending a lot of time crafting your response. That's one type of preparation you should be doing. And the other type of preparation is certainly practicing writing a response in 40 minutes, because that is what you need to be able to do in the HSC. So this is a pretty straightforward question. Eliot's poetry continues to engage readers through its poetic treatment of alienation and despair. So it's picked up 2 ideas in the poetry. In the light of your critical study, does this statement resonate with your own interpretation of Eliot's poetry? So you're being asked to deal with this. You know, in what ways is it dealing with these ideas? And you are told to make reference to at least 2 poems. Now, at least 2 poems means 2, but you may make some passing reference to a 3rd or 4th poem. You really don't have time to do much more than that. So this question's giving you the choice as to where you might go. This next question, a bit crueler. It does specify a poem in the context of your critical study. To what extent does your response to the closing stanza of Journey of the Magi inform your judgment of this poem and Eliot's poetry as a whole? Now, this probably would be accompanied with that closing stanza, and you're being asked to make detailed reference to the Journey of the Magi, as well as one other poem. So again, this is an example of a question where you'd be very, very frustrated and despondent if you realised in the exam room, no, that's not the poem I wanted to write about, and I don't really know what to say. Because there would be an expectation that a substantial amount of your response would be about Journey of the Magi. So you'd be picking up what ideas are there, what techniques are there, and how they are sort of explored in this poem and other poems. Now, so that's that one. Now, people are half alive, hungry for any form of spiritual experience. Now, this is last year's HSC question. So to what extent does this view align with your understanding of Eliot's poetry? In your response, make close reference to your prescribed text. Now, again, there's a bit of interpretation needing here. What do we mean by this? Is this kind of describing what are people looking for, and is this an idea that's explored in the poetry? It's actually a very fair question, because there are quite a few poems that you, in fact, all of the poems could work for this, and you would need to unpack what this statement means, developing a thesis on it, and then explaining in brief, you know, how you're going to explore your respective poems. Now, it just says make close reference to prescribed text, which is kind of interesting, because it's not specifying numbers of poems, but again, I don't think you can be too ambitious in a 40-minute response. But you can be very selective. You can make your selections from a variety of poems, and rather than feeling that you've got to, in sort of a very regimented way, march your way through 2 poems in some detail. Okay. Now, what I was going to talk about now is just what's on NESA's website, which is worthwhile looking at. And I've just copied this directly from the website. So this is not my words. This is directly from the website. In what were, from the HSC 2019, what were the markers feedbacks? I think it's quite worthwhile, because it kind of gives you some insight into why we've done what we've done in this particular lecture. So in better responses, students were able to demonstrate a perceptive understanding of Eliot's modernist context and how it influenced his stylistic approach. So we spent a lot of time talking about modernism. You need to know it. It needs to be part of your response. Demonstrate a sense of how motifs within and across poems, and I think that's the key word here, is across, synthesize these major concerns. So your better responses are going to integrate, synthesize ideas. Clearly articulate how philosophy and psychology are infused into a poetic form. So all of this contextual information we've been exploring needs to be embedded into your discussion. Skillfully explore how Eliot's ideas and approach engage the audience beyond his time frame. You know, why? At the end of the day, Eliot is certainly talking about what it means to be human. You know, what he's exploring in terms of that quest for meaning, that sense of despair, sense of estrangement, alienation, and so on, it very much resonates with our contemporary context. We can certainly argue that. And then finally, areas for students to improve, again from the HSC Markers Feedback, clarifying modernism as a literary movement. So I actually want you to talk about it. That's really important. Making links within and or between poems and seeing them as a suite. So not as isolated literary pieces, but interconnected, and how you can make those cross poem connections. Focusing on distinctive features and form rather than on micro-analysis. So micro-analysis is not necessarily going to cut it, because you're not asked to do some sort of detailed literary analysis of each poem. You're asked to answer a question by making those judicious selections. Using more detailed textual evidence that is linked to a thesis rather than technique-driven. Again, really worthwhile reading these feedback notes because they give us some really good tips. A thesis, an argument. How are you seeing the poetry? How do you interpret the question? I really want to wish you all the very best of luck with your studies this year. And I think with hard work and lots of practice, you should be able to score very well in Eliot. And really appreciate the fact that you are talking about the whole suite of poems, not just individual poems. Best wishes and good luck.